What if the most disturbing thing about the Passion of the Christ wasn't what appeared on screen, but what happened behind the camera? Before we go any further, if you're drawn to stories where faith, history, and mystery collide, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Jesus of the Voice channel. These stories don't end in one episode, and neither does this one. According to historical sources, the man portraying Christ stood nearly 6 feet tall. His body would soon be covered from head to toe in the markings of the whip. The method of execution was crucifixion. And here's the question that refuses to go away. Would anyone willingly give up their life to defend something they knew was false? The Passion of the Christ was never meant to be just another Hollywood production. It became the first and only film to attempt a brutally honest, historically grounded portrayal of what unfolded on Golgotha more than 2,000 years ago. A depiction of the ultimate sacrifice Christ made on behalf of humanity. But what most people never hear about is what happened when the cameras weren't supposed to capture anything at all. Behind the curtain of that filming process, something profoundly disturbing began to take shape. Events that defied natural explanation, presences that couldn't be accounted for, life-changing conversions, occurrences that seemed impossible to explain through coincidence alone. On that particular movie set, the boundary separating mere acting from genuine faith didn't just blur, it shattered completely. The suffering you witness on screen stopped being simulated. It became something tangible, something frighteningly real. Before long, every individual working on that film set came to understand something remarkable. This production about Jesus wasn't merely another religious movie. It had transformed into something far more powerful. A supernatural encounter that was actively changing the very core of who these people were. Consider the probability for a moment. What are the realistic chances that during the filming of any movie, a lightning bolt would strike the leading actor? And not just once, but twice, hitting the exact same location on his body. And that's not all. During the entire production, not just 1 or 2 mishaps, but a full count of 10 separate accidents would take place. The events that transpired throughout the making of the Passion of the Christ continue to stand, even to this very day, as one of the motion picture industry's most profound and unexplained mysteries. Hollywood's establishment turned its back on the project. Yet despite every obstacle, the impossible scenario played out before the world's eyes. A motion picture delivered entirely in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin, ancient tongues most audiences couldn't comprehend, featuring no recognizable Hollywood celebrities, receiving 0 promotional support, lacking any major studio's financial backing, somehow emerged as a global cultural phenomenon. Countless believers spanning every corner of the planet rallied together. The experience transcended what typically happens inside a theater. It became something much deeper, a spiritual awakening that reached far beyond the confines of the movie screen. The Passion of the Christ achieved a record that still stands. It became the most financially successful film ever released in a language other than English throughout the entire history of cinema. Yet, after the film reached audiences worldwide, that very success transformed into something else entirely. A burden, a curse of sorts. The entertainment industry machinery, along with media outlets everywhere, systematically worked to push Mel Gibson into what would become the darkest chapter of his existence. You'll want to remain with us until the very end, because this story is far from finished. 2 decades have passed since the original film's release, and now the filmmaker who dared to challenge Hollywood's conventional wisdom is making his return. He comes back bearing a commitment to unveil what took place during those mysterious hours between the moment of the crucifixion and the breaking of dawn. The continuation of the story, the resurrection of Christ. When the late 1990s arrived, Mel Gibson appeared to possess everything anyone could desire. He stood as the celebrated hero of Braveheart, representing the ideal image of an industry that viewed him as essentially immune to failure. But when you looked past the public image, beyond what the cameras captured, his personal life was disintegrating, piece by piece. His marriage was collapsing. Alcohol had taken control of his life. In conversations that would come years later, he opened up about feeling completely hollow inside, utterly lost, stripped of any sense of direction or purpose. He went so far as to admit something even more troubling, that he no longer wanted to continue living. He watched himself systematically destroying everything and everyone in his path. Gibson found himself caught in a destructive spiral of celebrity status and crushing guilt. But right in the middle of that overwhelming darkness, something occurred that he would later characterize as nothing less than divine intervention stepping into his life. One particular evening, completely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of everything his existence had become, he dropped to his knees in a state of brokenness and desperation. He started to pray in a way he hadn't approached God in many, many years. Gibson's upbringing had been steeped in Catholicism, deeply traditional in nature. His father, Hutton Gibson, embodied strict religious conviction in every aspect of his life. But Mel had walked away from all of that many years before. That dark evening, however, he picked up a Bible, and something dormant within him began to stir back to life. He established a daily practice of reading Scripture. The Gospels became an obsession, particularly those chapters detailing the Passion and the Crucifixion. Within those ancient pages, he discovered something that had been absent from his life for far too long: a sense of genuine purpose. Years would pass before he would openly confess the truth of what he'd come to understand. The person I had become was terrible. My own sins were among the very first to drive the nails into Christ's hands on that cross. That single statement would mark the starting point of everything that followed. Mel Gibson's desire to act had vanished. What he sought now was redemption, and he came to understand that the only path to achieving it was through telling the story that had shaken him to the very foundation of his being. The story of Jesus' ultimate sacrifice. No embellishments or softening, no filtering or sanitizing. Exactly as the events unfolded, with every bit of the rawness and agony intact. That's the moment when the vision for the Passion of the Christ first took root in his mind. This wasn't conceived as a typical Hollywood venture. It emerged as something far more personal, a sacred promise, a quest for redemption. Gibson immersed himself in studying every available detail concerning the Passion. The traditional stations of the cross, the Gospel accounts, the mystical writings of Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, whose spiritual visions portrayed Christ's suffering with an intensity that sent chills through anyone who read them. Emmerich never once traveled beyond Germany's borders, yet her descriptions of specific locations in the Holy Land possessed a level of accuracy that archaeological discoveries would validate many decades afterward. Gibson developed what could only be called an obsession. His desire was for audiences to experience Christ's suffering as though they themselves stood as eyewitnesses to those events. He didn't want people to simply watch the Passion unfold on screen. His intention was for them to feel it coursing through their own bodies, not as some distant historical account, but as something immediate and visceral. This led him to a decision that most would consider absolutely unthinkable. Every word spoken in the film would be delivered in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin, the actual languages Christ and his contemporaries spoke during that time in history. Not a single syllable in English would be heard, and the cast would include no Hollywood stars whatsoever. He made the firm decision that the film couldn't feature any faces that audiences might recognize from other productions. The whole concept seemed like madness. No producer in their right state of mind would have agreed to finance such a project. Who in the world would be willing to fund a motion picture delivered entirely in dead languages, without any English dialogue whatsoever, possessing absolutely zero commercial viability according to conventional wisdom? When Gibson brought his vision to the major studios, their response came swiftly and with complete unanimity. The answer was no. Some executives told him in the most direct terms possible that it would become the most catastrophic box office failure ever created. Gibson would later remember how not a single entity in Hollywood showed any willingness to contribute even $1 toward financing the project. He recalled being asked repeatedly to reduce the violent content, to switch the language to English, to add some element of hope at the conclusion. But he understood that yielding on any of those points would mean it would no longer remain Christ's authentic story. This became the pivotal moment of decision. Gibson came to the realization that if he genuinely wanted to bring this story to the screen, he would need to proceed entirely on his own. And so he made what stands as one of the most financially risky decisions in the entire history of filmmaking. He chose to finance the entire movie using his personal wealth. Properties were sold. Everything he had accumulated was invested. Nearly $45 million from his own bank account went into producing The Passion of the Christ. No studio stood behind him. No distribution company guaranteed anything. No safety net existed whatsoever. If the movie failed to connect with audiences, he would lose absolutely everything he owned. But Gibson wasn't pursuing commercial success. His pursuit was redemption. He would later reveal that it wasn't a movie he wanted to make. It was a movie he felt compelled to make, as though he had no other choice. That decision isolated him from the Hollywood establishment, yet it reconnected him with something he'd believed was lost forever: his faith. And that single step, taken alone and in opposition to every reasonable prediction, wouldn't merely alter the trajectory of his own life. It would permanently transform the landscape of religious cinema as the world knew it. When Mel Gibson committed to creating The Passion of the Christ, one question haunted his thoughts relentlessly. Who could possibly take on the role of portraying the Son of God? Gibson understood clearly that this role represented far more than just another acting job. This wasn't about memorizing dialogue or simulating emotions for the camera. This was about physically embodying the pain, the complete surrender, and the sacrifice of a figure who altered the entire course of human history forever. Gibson wasn't searching for just an actor. He was searching for someone genuinely willing to endure real suffering. And very few individuals in Hollywood possessed the preparation or the willingness to meet such extraordinary physical demands. For months that stretched on, he declined offers from famous names. He had no interest in recognizable faces or celebrity performers who would pull audience attention away from the central message. His desire was for audiences to look at the screen and see not an actor playing a part, but Jesus himself. Then, one particular name emerged from consideration: Jim Caviezel. He was a Catholic actor, relatively young, reserved in his demeanor, possessing a gaze that seemed both serene and intensely focused. He delivered strong performances in The Thin Red Line and Angel Eyes. Though his career showed upward momentum, he hadn't yet become a household name. Gibson extended an invitation for him to visit his home in Malibu. What was meant to be a brief meeting extended to 3 full hours. Their conversation covered faith, darkness, sacrifice, and the enormous weight of history. But Gibson offered him a stark warning. If you accept this role, there's a very real possibility you might never receive work in Hollywood again. Silence filled the space between them. Then Caviezel responded with words that would seal his commitment. Every single one of us carries our own cross. We either choose to carry it forward, or we get crushed beneath its weight. It was right at that moment when something unusual occurred. While they were going over the remaining details, Jim mentioned in passing that he had just recently turned 33 years old, the traditional age of Christ at the time of his crucifixion. Mel stopped what he was doing and stared at him with an expression mixing surprise and something like awe. Then Jim added one more detail. His initials are J.C. Mel's reaction was immediate. He froze completely, then quietly said something to the effect of, "You're freaking me out." That moment became recognized as a sign. At least from their perspective, it wasn't mere coincidence. It felt as though something greater was orchestrating this choice, guiding the entire process forward, propelling both of them toward a story that extended far beyond simply making a movie. From that point forward, the level of commitment became absolute. Caviezel engaged in spiritual preparation with intense focus. He prayed before stepping into every single scene. He attended daily Mass without fail. He dedicated hours to meditating on the gospel texts. But his preparation extended beyond the spiritual dimension. He understood that his physical body would need to become a living canvas for displaying pain. He subjected himself to an intense and brutal physical training regimen. Yet, what he was about to experience during the actual filming would exceed anything his imagination had prepared him for. Throughout the production of The Passion of the Christ, things began happening that defied rational explanation. Something unusual hung in the atmosphere on that particular set. No one present could define it with precision, but absolutely everyone felt its presence. Sometimes it manifested as an unexpected silence that descended without warning. Other times it appeared as a sudden gust of wind that whipped across the location, seemingly out of nowhere. Gibson selected the cold landscapes of Matera in Italy as the primary filming location. The region isn't typically known for weather extremes, yet during the production, conditions became strangely erratic and unpredictable. Mornings that began under sunny, clear skies would suddenly transform into ominous darkness within mere minutes. A scene might commence under perfectly calm weather, and without any warning whatsoever, powerful wind gusts would materialize. So strong, they literally tore tents from their moorings and toppled heavy equipment. Initially, the crew dismissed these occurrences as challenging weather conditions. But then something happened that changed the entire perspective, transforming what had been seen as a challenge into what many began perceiving as a warning. While filming a scene from the Sermon on the Mount, Jim Caviezel made his way up a hill with his heart fully engaged in the moment. But without warning, the weather underwent a dramatic shift. The production crew had ascended into the hills of Matera in southern Italy to capture one of the most hope-filled sequences in the entire motion picture, the Sermon on the Mount. The air carried the scent of damp earth. A gentle breeze moved across the landscape. Jim Caviezel was making his preparations to climb the hillside. All around him, technicians were running final checks on microphones and camera equipment. But then, suddenly, the weather changed completely. Within the space of mere seconds, the air took on a heavy quality, and clouds began gathering directly overhead. He would later recount that for a brief moment, a chill traveled down his spine. He sensed that something was about to occur, and then a brilliant white light ripped across the sky. A lightning bolt struck him directly, the electrical current passing through his entire body from the top of his head all the way down to his feet. The light seemed to split the heavens themselves and completely engulfed him. The sound of the blast was absolutely deafening. Camera equipment shut down instantly. Technicians began screaming. For a suspended instant, everything seemed to hang in supernatural silence. From his position at a distance, Mel Gibson witnessed the entire scene unfold. Jim Caviezel stood there, his entire body completely wrapped in brilliant light, sparks actually visible in his hair. Against all odds, he had survived. Then, the assistant director, Jan Michelini, rushed up the hillside to provide assistance. But the moment he reached his side, Another bolt of lightning struck the exact same location. 2 separate strikes, hitting the same spot in less than 60 seconds. Both men were thrown to the ground by the force of the shock wave. The crew stood completely motionless, staring up at the sky in stunned silence. The mathematical probability of this occurring was virtually 0. Some crew members were openly crying. Others began praying. The paramedics quickly made their way toward the 2 men. But incredibly, both were alive. They didn't even show burns or any visible injuries to speak of, just a dazed expression, clothing slightly singed, and the distinctive smell of ozone hanging thick in the air. The paramedics couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. They'd never encountered anyone who survived a lightning strike like that. From that day moving forward, something fundamental shifted on the set. No one discussed it openly in normal conversation, but everyone whispered about it in quiet moments. What were the actual chances this was nothing but coincidence? Some individuals interpreted it as a warning from above. Others called it a blessing. But everyone reached agreement on one thing. After that particular day, the entire atmosphere of filming felt different. Every single workday began with a prayer. The technicians, many of whom didn't consider themselves believers, started crossing themselves before activating the cameras. Even the weather itself seemed to respond to whatever story was being told. When they shot sequences depicting suffering, the sky would cloud over dramatically. When they captured moments of forgiveness, sunlight would break through and return. But the mystery surrounding the production was only beginning to unfold. The time arrived to film the scourging sequence. Gibson wanted the scene captured with unflinching, brutal realism. He wanted every person in the audience to physically feel the weight of sin being laid upon human flesh. To provide protection for Caviezel's body, the crew had positioned a thick wooden board behind his back. But in the intensity and raw energy of the scene's execution, the angle of one particular strike went wrong. One of the actors portraying a Roman soldier swung the whip with excessive force. The metal tip attached to the whip flew through the air and embedded itself directly into Caviezel's unprotected back. The scream that erupted from Caviezel, the one you actually hear in the finished film, wasn't acting at all. It was genuine, visceral pain. He would later describe it. I couldn't draw breath. The intensity of the pain was so overwhelming that my body immediately went into shock. I thought it would only happen that one time, but it happened again. The second time the mistake occurred, the blow literally tore his flesh open in a line measuring over 12 inches in length. That scar remains visible on his body to this day. And that moment of real suffering was captured in the final edit of the film, permanently immortalized in what became the most emotionally heart-wrenching scene in the entire production. But the ordeal of physical pain didn't conclude there. The ultimate test still lay ahead. The day came to film the Way of the Cross sequences. Gibson insisted on absolute authenticity. A real cross constructed from solid wood, weighing in excess of 150 pounds. Caviezel was required to carry it beneath the scorching sun, to fall repeatedly, and to rise back up again and again. During one particular take involving a fall, the plan called for a soldier to hold the massive beam steady so it wouldn't come crashing down on top of him. But the soldier missed his timing. The cross collapsed and fell with its complete weight directly onto Caviezel's head. He described it afterward. It crushed my head like a melon. Some of the blood you see on screen was makeup, but some of it was actually mine. But that wasn't the extent of the injury. The falling cross had dislocated his shoulder joint. The pain reached unbearable levels. The crew immediately rushed forward to help him. But Caviezel refused to halt production. He wanted that particular fall to be captured on film exactly as it happened. He wanted the world to witness, even if only for a brief moment, what it actually means to fall while carrying the weight of a cross upon your body. And Gibson understood what he was trying to communicate. He didn't order the camera to stop rolling. During the minutes that followed, the actor continued walking forward with his shoulder completely out of place. Every single movement he made was real. Every scream that emerged from his throat was genuine. His contorted facial expressions, the tears, the moans that erupted from deep within him, none of it was pretend. It was pure, unfiltered pain being transformed into something like prayer. Medical doctors examined him after that scene finally concluded. They confirmed the shoulder dislocation. They strongly suggested he take several days of rest to recover. But Caviezel refused their recommendation. He returned to the set the very next day, still dealing with swollen arms and a shoulder that had gone numb. Mel Gibson would confess years later that they never reshot that scene. What you witness in the final cut of the film, the body collapsing, the cross hitting the ground, is exactly what actually occurred in that moment. In the end, the line separating acting from reality had been completely erased. The physical pain coursing through the actor's body merged seamlessly with the spiritual sacrifice of the character he was bringing to life. The passion was no longer simply a movie production. It had transformed into something else entirely, a form of penance. From that moment moving forward, Jim Caviezel's body began to break down. Filming continued despite the toll, but the cold weather conditions became increasingly merciless. The final crucifixion sequences, the shots on Calvary, the body suspended between heaven and earth, were all filmed during winter months. The actor hung suspended from the cross for hours at a time, remaining motionless, wearing nothing but a thin tunic, his body drenched by freezing rain and battered by gusts of icy wind. The crew made every effort to keep him warm during breaks between takes, but their efforts proved useless. His core body temperature began dropping to dangerous levels. Soon enough, medical professionals confirmed what had become inevitable: hypothermia. His lips took on a purple hue. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His breathing grew increasingly weak. Obviously, filming needed to stop, but Caviezel refused to come down. His words at that time were, "Christ didn't come down from the cross. Neither will I." The days that followed became a severe test of human endurance. The extreme physical strain, combined with the relentless cold, soon resulted in double pneumonia. His weakened body stopped responding normally. With each passing day, he lost more weight. Fiction and reality began to blur together in a way that became genuinely terrifying. Makeup artists labored for 8 to 10 hours, covering his body with prosthetic wounds and artificial blood. But to save time on the intensive process, Caviezel began sleeping with the makeup still applied to his skin. The skin on his face developed cracks from the combination of cold temperatures and paint chemicals. The prosthetics he was required to wear for days at a time caused painful blisters and severe irritation. No stunt doubles were employed. No special effects were used to simulate his pain. The suffering was absolutely real. The cameras captured everything exactly as it unfolded. It became a kind of physical penance, a performance that had already crossed far beyond the normal boundaries of cinema. And the question lingered in everyone's mind: would Mel Gibson actually stop filming? The crew members, witnessing the actor's torment, pleaded with him to halt production. But Gibson, speaking with a calm voice, replied, "If he can endure it, so can we." Both men understood clearly what they were engaged in. They weren't seeking to create a spectacle. They were seeking to capture truth, a truth so profound and deep that it could only be conveyed through genuine sacrifice. During the crucifixion filming, Gibson gave orders for the cameras to continue rolling, even as the actor suffered visible spasms from the extreme cold. Neither man wanted to soften what was happening. There were no editorial cuts to hide the suffering, no alternative camera angles to make it less shocking to witness. Gibson refused to edit out the most difficult parts during post-production. Caviezel, even while running a fever and with his shoulder wrapped in bandages, insisted on completing every single scene. Every tear that fell was real. Every spasm triggered by the cold was genuine. After everything that had transpired, the lightning strikes, the scourging injuries, the dislocated shoulder, the hypothermia, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere pervading that set. It wasn't fear or simple exhaustion. It was presence. A profound sensation took hold, as if every stone, every breath of wind moving across the location, every shadow cast by the equipment was somehow watching what unfolded. No one present could offer an explanation for it, but absolutely everyone felt it deep within. During the sequences depicting the most agonizing moments, silence would completely overtake the entire set. Not a single cough, not even a whisper. Only the sound of wind moving through the space, and occasionally the muffled sound of someone weeping who couldn't bear to watch anymore. Several crew members would confess later that they couldn't identify where the acting ended and where genuine faith began. Some actors would retreat to private areas to cry during breaks between takes. Others, without understanding exactly why, spontaneously began to pray. Mel Gibson himself was frequently observed walking away from the set, his eyes red-rimmed, murmuring prayers under his breath. The makeup artists, exhausted from seemingly endless workdays, admitted to feeling a strange sense of calm settling over them in the midst of utter chaos. There were also individuals who claimed the cameras managed to capture lights that didn't originate from the stage lighting equipment. Brief flashes that would appear momentarily and then vanish without any technical explanation being available. The lead cameraman gave his sworn testimony that at one particular moment, while focusing his lens on Caviezel's face as he hung on the cross, he witnessed a glowing figure move directly behind him, a white shadow that crossed through the frame and disappeared. But when they went back to review the footage later, nothing whatsoever appeared there. Then rumors started spreading among the technicians and production assistants. Some claimed to have encountered men dressed entirely in white garments, walking between the cameras, observing everything, offering specific directions on how to position lighting equipment or adjust the angle of a particular scene. They carried themselves with a calm demeanor. Their gaze seemed profound. They possessed a silent authority in their presence. They would give precise guidance, then simply disappear. And when crew members attempted to find out who these individuals were, nobody could identify them. They didn't appear on any official records. Nobody on the production team had hired them. Yet everyone who encountered them agreed on the same basic description. By the time filming reached its conclusion, the rumor had evolved into something close to legend. Multiple crew members insisted that when reviewing photographs taken on the set, these men in white didn't appear in any shots whatsoever. Not in the video recordings, not in the behind-the-scenes footage, not even on the security camera systems monitoring the studio grounds. Gibson would say afterward, "There were things that no one can offer an explanation for, but everything unfolded exactly as it was meant to." The atmosphere became so intensely charged that for many individuals involved, the filming experience transformed into something resembling a spiritual retreat. Some of the extras who had initially arrived simply to work as background actors made requests to confess their sins or to be baptized before production came to an end. Several of the main actors experienced conversions during the filming process itself. One of them was Luca Leonello, the actor cast in the role of Judas Iscariot. Up until that point in his life, he had openly declared himself an atheist, quite cynical when it came to matters of faith. But after living through those intense weeks on the set, he made a confession that he had converted to Christianity. Following the completion of filming, he was received into the Catholic Church and was baptized along with members of his family. He would later confess, "I was a complete non-believer. I participated in the Passion as nothing more than an actor. But when it ended, I couldn't stop my thoughts from returning to the figure of Jesus. Playing the character of Judas somehow made me understand God's love and his capacity for forgiveness. The film changed the entire trajectory of my life. I discovered faith and received baptism. And his experience wasn't an isolated case. Pietro Cerubi was the Italian actor cast in the role of Barabbas, the criminal who gets released instead of Jesus. It was a brief role, almost entirely without dialogue, yet filled with powerful symbolism. Barabbas represents the guilty individual who walks free, while the innocent one dies in his place. And it was in that exchange of gazes precisely where the miracle took place. During the filming of the scene before Pilate, Cerubi was supposed to exchange a brief look with Jim Caviezel, while the crowd surrounding them shouted, "Crucify him!" Nothing more than that, just a simple look. But when he actually did it, something pierced straight through him. He would later open up about it in an interview. "When I looked directly into Caviezel's eyes," he recounted, "I didn't see an actor performing. I saw a depth that didn't seem human. I felt as though Jesus was looking directly at me and forgiving me." That single experience transformed him completely. For weeks afterward, he couldn't sleep properly. He couldn't stop thinking about that gaze. After filming wrapped up entirely, he embraced faith wholeheartedly, was baptized, began traveling to give talks, and years later authored a book titled From Barabbas to Jesus, in which he chronicled his entire conversion journey. But there were additional surprises among the cast members. Amid the bright set lights and the quiet murmur of prayers being spoken, one woman kept something hidden. Maya Morgenstern, the actress portraying Mary, the mother of Jesus, was carrying a child. No one had any knowledge of it. Not the crew members, not the makeup artists, not even Mel Gibson himself. She would later confess that her pregnancy gave her something that simply can't be faked through acting. A special radiance, an inner presence that seeped naturally into every gesture she made. And those who looked at her closely could somehow sense it. One of the reasons Mel Gibson selected her actually related to her surname. Morgenstern translates to morning star in the German language. It felt like a sign to him. This was also one of the ancient titles historically given to the Virgin Mary, the morning star, the one who announces the coming of light in the midst of surrounding darkness. But in stark contrast to Maya's sweetness and warmth, Rosalinda Celentano took on the most disturbing and spiritually dangerous role. Of all the scenes filmed throughout the Passion of the Christ, there's one that remains shrouded in particular mystery. Jesus, bent beneath the weight of Roman lashes, bleeds profusely while the crowd screams their demand for his condemnation. And in the midst of all that chaos, the camera lens lingers on a figure moving slowly through the crowd of men. A woman dressed entirely in black garments, her face cold and expressionless, her eyes fixed in an unsettling stare. She carries a baby, cradled in her arms. But this child is not human in appearance. It possesses an aged face. Its skin appears grayish, and its gaze is so deeply unsettling that it seems to mock the Savior's pain. Mel Gibson selected Rosalinda Celentano to embody Satan specifically because he wanted an androgynous face, ambiguous in nature, neither clearly male nor clearly female, a figure designed to unsettle anyone viewing it. They shaved Rosalinda's eyebrows completely. They filmed her in slow motion to prevent natural blinking. They overlaid a man's voice over her own voice. She lost weight deliberately. She followed a strict dietary regimen of rice and beans. Her natural beauty became uncomfortable to witness, unreal in quality, a reflection of something that appears divine on the surface, but is corrupted underneath. In that particular scene, she was holding a baby, but there was something deeply disturbing about it. The baby appeared to resemble an aged man with visible hair on its back. It served as a metaphor for corrupted love, the perversion of what should be sacred and pure. Gibson positioned that scene at the absolute cruelest moment of Christ's torment, right at the point when the soldiers turned Jesus' body around to whip him from the front side. The pain reaches its absolute peak. And at that precise moment, Satan appears, incarnated as a mother figure holding deformed, corrupted life. The dark mirror image of Mary and her son. It was hell itself celebrating what it believed to be heaven's defeat. Rosalinda would confess years later that filming that particular scene left her emotionally devastated. She said she spent weeks alone in complete silence, emotionally preparing herself to film it. But when the actual moment arrived, she felt there was something genuinely real in that representation of evil. She felt what she described as a dark presence. She said that during the filming process, the air felt oppressively heavy, as if the atmosphere itself became unreal. That role changed her life so profoundly that after the film's completion, she stepped away from cinema entirely for a period of time and dedicated herself to painting instead. On the other hand, the actor playing Jesus Christ, Jim Caviezel, seemed to have entered into an entirely different state of being. Many people said he was no longer acting in the traditional sense, that he had become an extension of the character himself. His gaze had undergone a transformation. He barely spoke at all between takes, and when he did speak, his voice emerged as almost a whisper. Some people remembered seeing him staring up at the sky, as if waiting to receive an answer from above. When they finally rolled the last scene, the resurrection, the atmosphere filled with a sense of anticipation unlike anything before. The cold weather was still present, but something in the air itself had transformed completely. Many individuals wept openly when they witnessed the light entering into the tomb's cave. Others stood completely motionless, unable to find words to explain what they were feeling deep within. And so, when Gibson finally shouted out, "Final cut!" the echo of those words didn't sound like the typical end of a movie production. It sounded like a liberation of some kind. Many crew members knew with certainty they had witnessed something that went far beyond the normal scope of filmmaking. And as they began to dismantle the crosses beneath Matera's gray sky, many individuals couldn't help but think the exact same thing. Because on that particular set, many genuinely felt that God had passed through that place. Mel Gibson returned to Los Angeles with his heart ablaze. He had gambled everything he possessed, his reputation, his fortune, his entire career. But not a single entity in Hollywood would agree to promote his film. They told him it was far too violent, far too religious, far too risky from a commercial standpoint. But he didn't yield to that pressure. He financed the distribution himself, pouring in an additional $15 million. He screened it in churches, in schools, in parish halls. He allowed the message to spread from person to person, from mouth to mouth, like a sacred calling. Meanwhile, the major studios laughed about it. They made jokes at his expense. But what they didn't realize was that he was about to ignite a flame that would sweep across the entire world. On February 25, 2004, Ash Wednesday, The Passion of the Christ premiered in theaters nationwide. And what unfolded was genuinely historic. There was no red carpet event, no massive advertising campaigns. But even without those things, from the very first day, the lines of people waiting stretched for entire city blocks. They resembled religious pilgrimages more than movie lines. People carried rosaries. A thick silence hung over the crowds. Prayers were whispered under their breath. The entire Christian community mobilized as one. Churches organized transportation caravans to bring people to see the film. Parish communities purchased tickets for whole congregations. Showings sold out instantly. What had begun as one man's personal obsession transformed into a collective act of faith. In many cities across the country, the screenings turned into spontaneous liturgies. Priests celebrated masses or led moments of prayer right inside the theater spaces. And viewers left the theaters crying, moving in silence, as if they had just witnessed a spiritual awakening taking place before their eyes. There were reports of fainting spells, dizzy episodes, viewers who simply couldn't bear to watch the flogging scenes. In Kansas, there was one particular case that made headlines around the entire world. A 56-year-old woman died of a heart attack during the crucifixion scene on the very day of the premiere. Spontaneous conversions occurred. Prayers broke out right in the theater halls themselves. In Brazil, in Mexico, in Poland, in the Philippines, movie theaters transformed into something resembling temples. Churches overflowed with people returning to worship. Pastors began preaching sermons centered on the film. And then the impossible happened. The Passion of the Christ achieved the status of highest-grossing non-English language film in the entire history of cinema. The numbers seemed completely unreal. It earned over $610 million worldwide, more than $370 million in the United States alone, more than any major blockbuster released that year. A work delivered entirely in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin, with absolutely no Hollywood stars, no traditional advertising campaign, and no studio backing whatsoever, had become a phenomenon that spanned the entire globe. For 2 full decades, it remained the highest-grossing non-English language film ever produced. No other film spoken entirely in ancient tongues, without stars, without studio backing, without modern dialogue, had ever come close to matching its reach or its impact. What Hollywood once mocked as career suicide became a cultural and spiritual landmark that refused to fade with time. But success came at a cost. For Mel Gibson, the years that followed were brutal. The industry that had once celebrated him now distanced itself completely. Media scrutiny intensified. Controversies erupted. His name became synonymous not with triumph, but with exile. Hollywood had little interest in forgiving a man who had defied its rules and succeeded without permission. For a long time, he disappeared from the director's chair altogether. Jim Caviezel's path proved no easier. Rather than launching him into superstardom, the role effectively stalled his mainstream career. Offers vanished. Doors quietly closed. He would later reflect that portraying Christ cost him everything Hollywood could offer, but gave him something far greater in return. He had accepted the cross, and the weight of it followed him long after the cameras stopped rolling. Yet while careers faltered, something else endured. The Passion of the Christ never lost its grip on audiences. Year after year, it continued to be screened in churches, homes, and quiet gatherings across the world. People returned to it not for entertainment, but for confrontation, for reflection. It was not a film that could be passively consumed. It demanded something from those who watched it. And then, slowly, time began to shift the narrative. 2 decades after the original release, Mel Gibson emerged once again, not with apology, not with retreat, but with resolve. He announced his intention to complete the story he had begun. Not a remake, not a sequel in the traditional sense, but a continuation focused on the most mysterious span of all: the hours between the crucifixion and the resurrection, the silence, the descent, the unseen battle between death and life, the resurrection. It is a subject few filmmakers have dared to approach with seriousness, let alone reverence. And yet, for Gibson, it was never optional. The Passion was never meant to stand alone. Suffering without resurrection would remain unfinished truth. The story demanded completion. And so the question returns, full circle. Would anyone willingly give up their life for something they knew to be false? Men lost their health, careers were derailed, reputations were destroyed, fortunes were risked, and still, none of them recanted. None of them walked away claiming it was all illusion or coincidence. Instead, they spoke of purpose, of presence, of something that passed through that set and left permanent marks behind. Perhaps the Passion of the Christ was never just a movie. Perhaps it was a reckoning, a moment in time when the boundary between story and reality grew dangerously thin, when faith stopped being theoretical, when suffering refused to remain symbolic, when a film set became a place where many believed, rightly or wrongly, that heaven and earth briefly collided. And now, as the resurrection story prepares to be told, one truth remains unchanged. The story was never finished, and maybe it still isn't.